And good afternoon, welcome to Open Studio right here on DSTV channel 263. My name is Phemelo Mhlanga, aka the P Master, and I'm your host for today's show. Now on today's show, we are joined by Pharrell Hunter, who is the country director of DVV International, who's going to be telling us more about the Adult Education Forum right here on studio, taking us through that and more. So make sure that you're going to be staying tuned in with us. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Phemelo.
Well, it is amazing to be having you on the studio this afternoon. Just before we can go anywhere further, can you briefly introduce yourself? Tell us about you and the role that you play in DVV International and the Adult Education Program.
So DVV International is an international non-profit organization. It works in some 30 countries globally. I'm the country director in South Africa. We've been in South Africa for just over 20 years now. And the Adult Learning Forum is one of our NGO partners in the country, and their role primarily is to advocate and lobby for a more progressive youth and adult education sector. And it does this in a range of ways, which I suppose we can talk about as we go along.
All right, now tell us about the Adult Education Forum. How long has it been around?
So the Adult Learning Forum is probably about 18 years old now. It's been around across communities, particularly in the Western Cape, but works across the country as well with other organizations that it networks and lobbies alongside, particularly to improve the policy framework for youth and adult education in the country. And of late has particularly been part of the post-school education framework that's being developed, so that hopefully we can have an education opportunity for youth and adults in our communities that's really more relevant to what people need. You know, the formal schooling system that many youth, and in South Africa the stats tell us that there's in the region of 4 million youth who are not in education, employment or training. And many of them have very little prospect, despite perhaps some qualification, perhaps some schooling, very little prospect of actually finding work. And what we do need is to explore alternative, not only learning methods, but also what people generally call skills, so that youth can find alternative work opportunities, ways of existing socially, because clearly, for us, education isn't only about the workplace.
All right. Now, the Adult Learning Forum is right-based. Can you take us through that? What does it mean when they say that the program is right-based?
So, for us, and certainly constitutionally in South Africa, and through global commitments as well, education is a basic human right. And that's not only a human right for children to get through schooling. It's not only a human right for youth to go to universities once they complete schooling. It's a right enshrined in our constitution, section 27 if I recall correctly, that says everybody has the right to education, including adult basic education. And it is in that vein that the Adult Learning Forum and its associate organizations and other social movements lobby for that right to be realized in South Africa, which to date, unfortunately, has not been the case. Despite the 24 or so years of democracy and much work being done in certain quarters to try and realize the right to youth and adult basic education in particular, it remains a struggle. Very little resources goes into our sector to provide youth and adult education. So it's certainly something that the Adult Learning Forum and organizations alongside it continue to lobby and campaign for.
I must say it's a very interesting movement. You're stating very important things there. Now, looking into some of the sustainable development goals that are actually put in place and proclaimed by the UN, take us through them. I believe you mentioned a little bit earlier on when you had a conversation that there's a number of them, but there's one specifically that focuses on education. Take us through that.
So there are 17 sustainable development goals. And these were declared and committed to by heads of state in 2015, in September to be specific, 2015, where heads of state committed to the realization of these goals over a 15-year period, so in other words, by 2030, and I think they call it Agenda 2030. Now, there have been these targets that are set globally in times before. And so, yes, recommitted now are the Sustainable Development Goals. And goal number 4 in particular refers to education, the right to education, and what it refers to as also the right to lifelong learning. And particularly, I suppose, when people think about lifelong learning, they think about education, if you like, from the cradle to the grave. And I suppose it's the latter years, so from youth and further up, which is our focus, and why we find that that goal very important. But of course, you know, it's a goal on paper for all countries, and it's only when they make the necessary commitments, put the necessary resources into it, lobby a range of social players in a country, that these goals can really be realized. And to date, of course, that remains, as I said, a struggle.
All right. Now, can you just briefly, because we left a little bit, a small amount of time before we go to the break, briefly take us through the term inclusive and diverse, like into the educational context. We'll get into more detail with it when you come back from the break. Just briefly introduce us to that.
Yes. So inclusive certainly means, by the sheer nature of the word, that, you know, no one should be excluded. Diverse, of course, means that we cannot be narrow in our thinking in terms of what counts as useful education. Unfortunately, too much of the focus has been on qualifications that leads towards a job in the formal marketplace. History and experience tells us that the formal marketplace is an unreliable space. Doesn't guarantee jobs. We know there are millions of people in our country, including youth and adults who are out of work. So we have to think of education that, yes, considers how everybody comes into the center and is provided the opportunity to education, but also how we can make that diverse so that everybody's provided for in different ways.
All right, man. You're going to be continuing with all of that when you come back from the break. You heard it. Education is a basic human right, not just for younger people, but also it's open to anyone who would like to learn. And that is exactly what the Adult Learning Forum is all about. Right? You're going to be continuing with all of that when you come back from the break. Make sure that you stay tuned in right here with us on Open Studios DSTV channel 263. We'll be right back. And welcome back to it, Open Studio right here, DSTV channel 263. Just in case you just joined us, we are joined by Pharrell Willis, Country Director from DVV International, who's telling us more, or representing rather, the Adult Learning Forum, and taking us through more information with regard to that. Now, before the break, we got into more detail as to what the Adult Learning Forum is about, and then we briefly touched base into the meaning of the terms inclusive and diverse, and you're going to be continuing with that. Chris, welcome back.
Thanks very much.
Not Chris, rather, I'm so sorry about that. Pharrell, right?
Yes.
Yes, welcome back to it. Now we're going to be getting into this. How is the Adult Learning Forum actually making education more inclusive and diverse? You briefly explained that to us before the break. Now let's just get into how you guys are incorporating that into adult education.
So what I was saying is that traditionally, you know, useful or valuable education was deemed to be the education that happens in formal learning spaces, in schools, in colleges, in universities. Of course, which is true to a point. And I'm saying to a point because, you know, more and more those of us active in the sector have realized that, you know, we cannot limit the education domain to those spaces. Again, the context in South Africa is such that many people, in fact, don't easily have access to formal learning spaces. One only has to think of the vast expanses of rural areas, for example, and the fact that many people cannot easily access learning because it's, you know, or learning institutions because they are way too far from where people live. The points for us then, and what has come into a new policy framework that has been developed with inputs from some of us in the sector, is that we need to look at what are generally called alternative approaches to education. An alternative doesn't mean it is different in its purpose. The purpose of education, certainly for us, is that it must serve a much broader social benefit, where narrowly education, as I was saying before the break, traditionally served the benefit of qualifications towards jobs in a marketplace. So to cite one example, one of the organizations also that we work with, like the Adult Learning Forum, works in the cooperative space. And so for us, what's important is that youth, and we have examples of youth, for example, in local townships, Khayelitsha and Philippi, that work in cooperatives, and these cooperatives address livelihoods. Basically, not only people being able to produce to feed themselves and their families and their communities, but also to generate an income. And that doesn't have to be in the formal market space, it doesn't have to be in the dominant economy space, but at the local level where people live. And a book just published recently by the Nelson Mandela University, a unit there called the Center for Integrated Post-School Education and Training. The title of that book tells it all, in that it is titled Learning for Living. And I think we've missed that in former years in this country, where we didn't see the value of learning as something that relates directly to people's lives in all its dimensions, not only towards a qualification and a job in the marketplace. So I think that we have tried to lobby and advocated for what has now become part of the post-school education and training policy frameworks that talks to the need to provide a diverse range of educational opportunities for people. Again, those are policies on paper. They need to be realized, and they need to be realized by support from the side of the state in terms of funding and other necessary steps that need to be taken, and certainly by other role players like ourselves who are involved in the education space, particularly non-formal education spaces, because the focus, as I said, in the main has been informal education.
All right, and there's something that I want us to establish just quickly when we're referring to adult, because I believe a lot of people maybe might think that we're talking about like adult as in like older people. But what are you guys referring to by adult? Like, what is your, from which age category? Because of taking into account the education system in South Africa as to at what age do they accept people into schools, and in terms of adult, what does at what age category does the forum actually cater for?
So globally the definition, let's just start by the point of youth. So globally the definition for youth varies. They're either up to 25 years old, and that's the one benchmark. In the case of South Africa and a number of other countries, that can go up to 34 years old. In other words, 35 and older is generally deemed to be an adult. Now, when statistics is calculated and categories of youth are defined, we could either be talking up to 25 years old, or we could be talking up to 34 years old. So in the case of going up to 34 years old, we talk, as I said earlier on, of some 4 million youth who are not in education, employment, or training. So that is the huge component of people that need to be provided for. Beyond that, of course, we have adults, you know, and yes, we have examples of adults who participate in learning programs. You know, years ago, in my first introduction into adult education, there was a woman in the Northern Cape area of Camus who was 80 years old and sitting in what was then an adult literacy class. So there are no bookends to it. We're not saying, you know, you have to be this age or whichever age to participate in learning programs. I think there are certain stereotypes about, you know, who should benefit from education and where should a country's resources go to benefit people's learning opportunities. You know, that learning is only for the young, of course, is a myth we must debunk and say it is not so. So whether youth, whether younger adults, whether older adults, there should be no limitations placed on anybody's wanting to learn and being encouraged to learn. And when we take those barriers away from learning, that either say learning, as I said, is for the young, or that you know, learning is only for a skill, and learning is only towards a job in the workplace. When we bring down all those barriers, then I think we realize that learning can also be fun. And that if a Gogo wants to learn to read so that she can access her Bible, or can, you know, read any other bits of material around her, a poster on the wall at a health clinic or whatever it might be, then that should be sufficient, you know. And I think that's unfortunately, there's a lot of thinking still in the country and elsewhere today that says, you know, learning's not useful unless it leads towards a qualification. All
right, we've heard that one. Learning is for living. We're going to be continuing the conversations actually when we come back from the break with this, getting into more detail, and it's also finding out about their community centers. Do ensure that you stay tuned in right here. Open Studios, DSTV channel 263. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the last segment of Open Studios DSTV channel 263, touching base on all things about the Adult Learning Forum. Welcome back to it, Pharrell. Before the break, we actually we were talking about we said that we're going to be getting into rather the community learning centers, right? Take us through that, some of the about the community learning centers that are offered by the forum.
Yes. So the community learning centers are government spaces. Those of us old enough will remember that way back in time there used to be night schools, which again were primarily targeted at adults who either wanted to access literacy programs, others learning to read and write and count, also later on they became what we call public adult learning centers, which meant that people could go there and complete schooling. Formal education was offered there, what was known as adult basic education, which included literacy and some skills programs to a small extent. And as the framework changed and the policy shifted, we now have what we call community learning centers. And these community learning centers in the main still represent a very formal and traditional school modeled kind of education for youth and adults. And in some ways they will probably continue to be that, because a school model education is provided for by those centers where youth in particular and older and adults are able to then access a second chance to complete a school qualification. However, the way in which we now envisage those community learning centers changing, and the Adult Learning Forum and ourselves have been very vocal in this space to encourage the fact that these community learning centers need to offer not only the formal learning opportunities to youth and adults, but also to offer non-formal education in the form of what we call popular education, which allows for what people generally call critical citizenship, to allow citizens to think about their world. And when I say citizens, I'm not using narrow borders. Anybody who lives in a country, for me, whether they come from across the borders, that they're able to look at their world, ask questions about it, and think about how they can act to change it. And we know the world needs lots of changing. Our country needs lots of change. It's going through a lot of changes that are required. But who is to participate in those changes are really the citizens themselves. We cannot leave it up to governments and bureaucrats to only decide on what our country should look like and what the world should look like. So we're saying that these community learning centers should in fact be engaging in those sorts of conversations as well.
All right, now take us through the policy of post-schooling. I believe that what you've been talking about actually take us through that, to that as well, because you've been speaking about also informal education whatsoever. Take us through that.
So the policy frameworks that are now in place, it's called the Post-School Education and Training Policy Framework, that provides for all, well, they say it's post-schooling, but it could also include people who've never been to school in spaces like community learning centers. But that policy framework also refers to colleges and universities as much as it does to community learning centers. So it's a sort of three-tier structure. And that policy framework allows for us to reshape community learning centers to the kinds of spaces that we want it to be. So colleagues of ours from the Adult Learning Forum, for example, serve on community college structures in the Eastern Cape. Our colleague from the Western Cape serves as a college council representative, where engagements and discussions around what content is deemed to be relevant to be offered by these community learning centers, so that youth and adults can go there and obviously access programs that they see as important. And you know, in other parts of the world, these approaches have existed for many years. In Scandinavia, for example, countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, for more than 100 years they've been offering community education of a similar sort. Of course, we don't want to offer their kinds of programs. We need to offer community learning to people through our community learning centers locally. And people like ourselves have been part of those structures. I, as well, have just been invited recently to partake on the steering committee for the Western Cape College Council, they call it, rather Western Cape Community College, that will oversee the community learning centers and what kind of learning programs they will offer. So what I'm saying is that we are engaging in those spaces, saying, yes, so now the policy is beginning to shift, or has shifted to some extent. We now need to engage at the coalface, almost, as it were, at the community college structures and community learning centers to see to it that these programs do reach realization for people to access.
All right, now educators play a very vital role in this process as well. Now tell us about the capacity of adult educators and also what is being done to increase it, just briefly.
Yes, crucial question. So most of the educators who do teach in the community learning centers are formally trained.
Yeah.
So what mostly they can do very efficiently is provide formal education, which is very much the school model approach.
Yeah.
What we are now in the process of trying to assist the Department of Education in some spaces with is to say to look at how we can, if you like, retrain or further train educators at these centers to help them understand non-formal education, how one engages non-formal education and works with youth and adults. And to that extent, we've already started linking with some of the rural community learning centers who've approached us and are very interested in ensuring that they take these steps while policy still tries to catch up with practice. Yeah.
All right, now tell us how can we be able to get a hold of the Adult Learning Forum? What do we need to do to get a hold of that? Give us all that.
So in the province, Merle Fred is the coordinator and administrator, and I can give you her contact detail. I'll put out her cell number. I'm sure she's more than happy for that. That number is 082 402 3293.
Okay.
There's also an email address. It's ALForum, as in Adult Learning Forum. ALForum at mweb.co.za.
At mweb.co.za. All right, thank you so much for coming to you and sharing all that information with us. It has been very informative, I'd like to believe. And we thank you very much for your time and sharing your ideas with us.
Thanks, Pomelo. Great to have been here.
All right, man. And also thank you guys for choosing to be with us on today's show. I hope that you managed to pick up a lot of things for yourself. Hope that you also got those contact details if you'd like to also engage with the Adult Learning Forum and also find out more information about it. Do ensure that you follow all those right steps in finding out more and finding out how you can also be able to actually engage yourself more. One thing that we've learned from today's show is that education is open to anyone. It is a basic right and it is never too late, man. You can be of any age. Remember that we get educated, or rather they say learning for living. Thank you so much. Remember, if you'd like to find out more information about our show, do visit our Facebook page, that is Cape Town TV. From myself, Phemelo Mhlanga, aka the P Master, and everybody else from the Open Studio crew, it is goodbye and God bless.